I'm going to begin with, as people join us, a roundup of some of the things that we have been up to in 2023. It has been a busy year for us in London CND. We held our annual Hiroshima Day commemoration in Tavistock Square, which was attended by the Mayor of Camden, among others. And we supported this year's Nagasaki Day commemoration at the London Peace Pagoda. We used the buzz around the film Oppenheimer to organise a screening and panel discussion on the realities of nuclear war that the film fails to adequately depict. We also hosted a conference with panels on the new Cold War and nuclear imperialism, with a keynote from Jeremy Corbyn. We protested against the return of US nukes at RAF Lakenheath. This is particularly worrying for Londoners, as obviously RAF Lakenheath is not too far away, further along in the southeast. So we protested against we organised several demonstrations, in fact, outside the US Embassy. We've been vocal in our calls for peace talks during demos as part of Stop the War in Ukraine. And importantly, we also collaborated with other campaigns, including with Extinction Rebellion as part of the big one. We set up a new partnership with Queen Mary University, which enables us to film some of our events. So some people have been able to join us online. We've been thinking about how to make some of our activities as accessible as possible. And local groups have been very active too. For example, with the relaunch of Lewisham and Greenwich CND, plenty of stalls throughout the year and popular meetings, such as Bromley Borough CND's Peace One Day event and Lewisham CND's meeting, Stop the Drift to Armageddon. I know that many of you will have taken part in local and regional actions, perhaps even yesterday, to show our horror and disgust at the genocide currently taking place in Gaza as we speak. We're very pleased that today we'll have our second keynote from Ambassador Hussam Zumlot, who's the head of the Palestinian mission to the UK. His keynote will discuss the prospects for Palestine. I know this is a topic that we're all keen to discuss, and this is going to be followed by a plenary chaired by our Vice President, Murad Qureshi, bringing together 3 experts to discuss and assess the impact of the war on Gaza. But before this, we're very grateful to be joined by Labour MP for Streatham, Bell Ribeiro-Addy, who's going to share the view from Westminster in our first keynote, followed by a panel discussion which is titled Nuclear War Clouds Gathering. Bell was elected to Parliament as MP for Streatham in 2019 and served briefly as Shadow Minister for Immigration under Jeremy Corbyn. Bell is a member of the Socialist Campaign Group of MPs and a Vice Chair of Parliamentary CND. She devoted her maiden speech to reparations to former colonial subjects and is now Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Reparations. Welcome, Bell. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at today's conference, which you can see is titled "No Wars, and No Nukes," and that's definitely a message which I completely endorse. Now, when I was asked to speak, as you heard, I was asked to give the view from Westminster. And which has made pretty clear from its response to the current situation in the Middle East. Now, if this conference was being organised by Westminster, it would probably be called Wars and Nukes, if they were honest about it anyway. Because if we were in any doubt, this week in particular has reminded us of the UK's cross-party consensus on the commitment to militarism over diplomacy. Instead of putting diplomatic pressure on Israel to bring an end to its bombardment on a densely populated urban area, the US and the UK, its political leaders have actually launched joint strikes, restarting the war in Yemen, which we all know never truly ended. And this week, the government has pushed ahead with the dismal anti-boycott legislation that would ban public bodies from making ethical spending decisions and participating in boycott, divestment and sanctions campaigns without the express consent of the UK state. Now, this particular piece of legislation is intended to protect countries and companies that are involved in fossil fuels, the arms trade and human rights abuses, all from facing democratic pressures for their actions. It sets a terrible precedent which basically allows central government to strong-arm local authorities, universities, and pension funds into doing business with ally countries and corporate entities, no matter which crimes they are currently engaged in. This militarist consensus among the country's political establishment dictates that protecting people's shopping, as Rishi Sunak explained, Friday morning's airstrikes is more important than protecting people's lives in places like Gaza. And a key pillar of this militarist consensus is the unshakable necessity of possessing nuclear weaponry and promising to use it at any cost. That's the view from Westminster. And it's one that totally fails to reflect the reality of the present situation, from the antiquation of our trident nuclear deterrent to the altered global security situation and the UK public's political priorities. The view from Streatham, which I represent in Parliament, and the UK at large is very different to the view from Westminster. The nuclear and defence lobbies may be clamouring for more money for nuclear weapons, but none of my constituents are. It's an affront to human life that our political establishment continues to prioritise the maintenance of destructive nuclear weapons over the maintenance of basic public services. This is not to deny that those of us who do fight for disarmament are entering a difficult time of heightened tensions. We need to be ready for the challenge this poses to our activism, as governments point to re-erupting conflicts and say that's why we need nuclear weapons. As if the existence of nuclear weapons could somehow be abstracted from these conflicts or the global order that they're happening in. As if nuclear weapons make us safer and not more of a target in our more multipolar world. World military spending reached an all-time high of 2.24 trillion in 2023, as the number of warheads ready for use increased for the first time since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The UK government is at the forefront of this trend, along with Russia, Pakistan, India, and North Korea. All of these countries have already added to their stockpiles. Our warhead stockpile is expected to grow thanks to the government's announcement in 2021, and that it will raise its limit from 225 to 260 warheads. This is a breach of our commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's not just our nuclear weapons, because for the first time since 2008, it appears that we are seeing the return of US nukes to UK soil. In the Biden administration's 2023 defence budget request, the UK was added to the list of countries where infrastructure investment is underway at special weapons storage sites. This is alongside Belgium, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, where the US stores an estimated 100 B-61 nuclear bombs. I tabled a written parliamentary question about this at CND's request way back in 2022. The Defence Secretary's non-answer about the potential use of RAF Lakenheath as a special weapons storage site only underscores the likelihood that this is probably going to be the case. As well as increasing the stockpile and hosting US nukes, another concerning development is the lack of government transparency around these decisions. The decision to stop providing public figures on the UK stockpile makes it more difficult for us to scrutinise their actions and the enormous expense involved in developing weapons. Whilst our government rolls back to Cold War-style secrecy and gets involved in a new arms race, other countries are leading the charge for disarmament. The UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, came into force in 2021, banning their use under international law. Nuclear weapons have always been immoral, and under this treaty, they're illegal too. I was pleased in 2022 to attend the UN conference on the TPNW in Vienna. Our government didn't even bother to show up, even though there were delegates there from Kiribati, a place where we have, as the UK, tested nuclear weapons. TPNW has now been signed by 122 countries so far, but not the UK, which refuses to do so. This is because ratifying it would require our stockpiles to be dismantled, or at least a viable plan for disarmament being put in place. The TPNW exposes the nuclear division between the global north and the global south, and the racist foundations of who is and is not deemed fit to use and stockpile nuclear weapons. Because the history of nuclear weaponry is inseparable from the history of racism and imperialism. Nuclear powers became nuclear powers because of their preeminent imperialist credentials. Nuclear nations first tested their weapons on areas in dependent territories and colonies inhabited by disenfranchised communities and indigenous peoples. We're talking about New Mexico, Nevada, the Marshall Islands, the Montebello Islands, Maralinga, Emu Field in Australia, Kiribati, Kazakhstan, Algeria, French Polynesia, all places where you find people of colour. These communities suffered devastating humanitarian and health consequences as a result. The materials which are used in the bombs are frequently extracted by indigenous communities from colonized countries who live with the consequences of exposure in uranium mining. An American Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report from as recently as 2015 revealed that children born to Navajo parents still carry traces of uranium in their urine as a legacy to this. In 2010, declassified documents revealed details of Israel's offer to sell nuclear warheads to South Africa's apartheid regime in exchange for yellowcake uranium extracted from the resource-rich country's mines. This is worth remembering as senior members of Israel's government advocate the nuking of Gaza as an option, as the Heritage Minister did in November last year. All of this is while the American theorist Elaine Scarry calls it the racist foundation of nuclear architecture. The struggle against nuclear weapons is necessarily an anti-racist struggle, and it's worth remembering the efforts of these same affected communities at the forefront of the anti-nuclear struggle. But as the great Martin Luther King Jr. rightly asked, what will be the ultimate value of having established social justice in a context where all people, Negro and white, are merely free to face destruction by atomic war? It's not enough to be anti-nuclear. When we campaign against nuclear weapons, we need to campaign for the kind of world we want to see, a more democratic world, because there is nothing more deeply anti-democratic than the idea that one individual or a handful of people should hold such sway over such a monumental decision as whether to initiate nuclear Armageddon against the rest of humanity. We should campaign for a world where our plentiful resources are used for the protection and preservation of humanity on our planet, not for the potential eradication of entire places and peoples. A world where whether you live or die is not conditional on being born in the global south or the global north. And we need to keep pushing our politicians to recognise that the UK, public in the UK, and the global majorities understandably and overwhelmingly opposed to the stockpiling of nuclear weapons, but may be less inclined to see our government as part of the problem. I'm sure most of you will have read about the Trident incident earlier this year, although hopefully not in the Sun. The depth gauge of telling sailors how far beyond the waves they are failed on the decades-old Vanguard class vessel as it carried 140 members of crew and Trident II missiles through the Atlantic, with the submarine plunging dangerously close to its depths before it was rescued. World-beating stuff. This incident exposes the inherent risk of any nuclear system and the special stupidity of clinging to our aging deterrent. Even within the policy establishment, there was a strong view that Trident doesn't keep us safer, with various former defence secretaries coming out against this, even if it was often to advocate for more upgrades to the system rather than disarmament. We need to have a grown-up conversation about the price tag that comes with the renewal of this system at a time when the NHS is on its knees, when there's a chronic shortage of housing, when people can't even pay their energy bills, and when 4 million children in our country face food poverty, despite us being the 6th largest economy in the world. What that's going to take what it's going to take to ultimately dismantle nuclear arsenals is international solidarity and campaigning. It's an affront to all human life that the most powerful countries in the world are pouring more resources into destructive nuclear technologies whilst the planet burns, whilst many around the world are still dying from preventable diseases and hunger, and whilst global poverty grows at a faster rate since the Second World War. So our campaign must be global. We can't build a meaningful and lasting security for the many on the promise of mass destruction wielded by the few. We have to build a few bridges, not bombs. We need to keep this idea at the forefront of our campaigning. We need to keep up the pressure to disarm. We need to say no to US nukes on UK soil. And in the face of escalating nuclear tensions, we have to keep applying pressure to keep building bridges and keep fighting for a world full and free from the danger of nuclear weapons as they exist today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Belle. You've given us such a comprehensive overview of just the depth of the different moral dilemmas that are within this issue. I've invited questions from the audience. We have 5 minutes in order to answer some of these perhaps. We have one here in the chat from Mark Morgan, who is a member of Haringey CND. Mark asks, how highly do you rate the chances that a Labour government would send observers to TPNW state parties meetings? And also to take other measures in the direction of nuclear disarmament. What is the status of discussions on this issue within the party, and how can we best influence those before and after the upcoming election? Would you be able to speak to that topic, please, Belle?
Well, what I would say is that I'd hope they would send observers. That would be something that I'd definitely be asking them to do, and I'd hope they'd take other measures. In the lead up to the next general election, however, to be completely honest, I doubt that it's going to be something that's a discussion. You can see where people are pushing at the moment in the party in terms of policy, and I think there is a concern by some that people would see us as less strong, and that might affect our electoral chances, which I don't necessarily agree with myself, but I know that's the general view. I'd hope after a general election, this would change. And I suppose what people can do is what they can do in any democratic society. I think we need to make clear, and we need to make this clear in our numbers, that this is not something that we support. And I think if you do that, particularly in the run up to a general election, it can have a significant impact when everyone is concerned about their votes.
Thanks so much, Belle. Belle, you spoke about such a wide range of issues, for example, the UK not sending any delegates to the TPNW, as you've just spoken about in terms of Mark's question. You also spoke about the lack of transparency, the new warheads, which are also going to be added to the arsenal in the UK in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. You talked as well about how you have raised questions in 2022 about RAF Lakenheath and whether or not US weapons will end up there, and the lack of transparency there. I just wanted to reiterate some of these important points in case people had any particular questions about those things that they wanted to raise. It was great to hear you talk about international solidarity and how we need to continue to build this as a global movement, and to continue to find hope in the fact that this global ban treaty is continuing to be ratified by more and more countries. There is, as we know from polling that has been done, a lot of anti-nuclear sentiment, particularly when people are confronted with the realities of the cost of nuclear weapons, £205 billion during a cost of living crisis. It's wholly unacceptable on every level.
One thing I would add, Hannah, on the TPNW, which was quite worrying, visiting when I was at the conference and also speaking to different states. It was interesting to see how many in the global south had actually taken steps to ratify. But then it was also interesting to hear, and obviously this is in unofficial chatter, how many had been threatened not to ratify, and they had various different payments of aid were used as a means by which to prevent other countries from ratifying, which I think is particularly, well, I think that's quite sinister, really, to tie conditions like that to it.
Shocking, absolutely shocking. We have one more question here from Kate. I think this will have to be the final one, though. Kate asks if you think that there could be any mileage in a cross-party campaign against nuclear weapons.
I think there's always mileage in a cross-party campaign. I think, particularly in the current electoral system we have, on matters as key as this. I think people do like to see our parties join up and be clear on certain issues. It certainly adds more strength and weight to it. So there is mileage on it. However, I do hope, with the Labour Party being my party and the fact that we are built on socialist democratic principles, that this will become our policy.
Thank you so much, Belle. We've unfortunately run out of time, even though I'm sure that people still have many questions to ask. We're already being asked in the chat whether or not a transcript of your speech could be made available, so we'll talk to you privately about that afterwards. But thank you so much for joining us and for the opening keynote address that you have given. Thank you, Belle.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to our first plenary. The title of the plenary is Nuclear War Clouds Gathering. So I'm going to invite Carol Turner, Emma Dent-Coad, and Sam Mason to the Zoom stage. And I'm going to just introduce these three panelists. Carol Turner, I'm sure you all know, is the co-chair of London CND. She's also a CND vice chair and a member of CND's International Advisory Group. Carol is a nuclear disarmament and anti-war campaigner. She's active in Labour CND and she's a member of Stop the War's National Officer Group. Carol was a foreign policy advisor to UK parliamentarians for more than 15 years and is author of Corbyn and Trident, Labour's Continuing Controversy and Wolf to Wolfgang, A Political Life. Sam Mason is a well-respected national and international climate change activist. She's vice chair of CND and a member of CND's Trade Union Advisory Group. Sam specialises in just transition issues and is an active member of the Campaign Against Climate Change Trade Union Group. And finally, Emma Dent-Coad is a councillor in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea. She's a vice president of London CND and a long-time anti-war and peace campaigner. Emma won the parliamentary seat for Labour and served as MP for Kensington from 2017 to 19 and was a vice chair of parliamentary CND during this time. She's perhaps best known for her continuing work on the Grenfell Tower disaster. We're going to begin with Carol Turner, who is going to talk to us about nuclear prospects and priorities for 2024. Over to you, Carol.
Thanks, Chair. And welcome from me to all our friends that we know and to some of our new friends who I hope we'll be keeping in touch with after today's session. Belle has given such a thorough discourse on what's going on in the nuclear weapon world that much of what I had to say has been taken away. But perhaps that best leaves me able to focus more on an overview of what the relationship between war and nuclear weapons is right now, as I'm sure all of us realise a really dangerous one. Excuse me. So for the past couple of years, as Russia and NATO squared up over Ukraine, we've watched the threat of nuclear war draw nearer. The second anniversary of Russia's invasion, barely a month away, and there are no signs of an end of the war, and even fewer signs of Western leaders bringing the two round the negotiating table to speak together and to find a peace settlement. Russia stepped up its offensive in December. President Zelensky is appealing to the West for more arms. And guess who? Rishi Sunak has been the first to respond on Britain's behalf. At the beginning of 2004, and that was only a couple of weeks ago, at the beginning of 2004, however, the prospect of nuclear war is increasing. Not only is the war in Ukraine dragging on, but now Israel's war on Gaza threatens to spread into a wider war in the Middle East. The air attacks on the Houthi targets by Britain and the US are only the latest example of that conflict spreading. Hezbollah and the Israeli Defense Force are trading fire on Israel's northern borders. Pro-Palestinian groups in Syria and Iraq have taken some limited military action in support of Palestine. And whilst the South Africa case against Israel in the International Criminal Court highlights in front of the world just how politically isolated Israel is. Israel is, of course, a nuclear-armed state, as someone pointed out right from the start in the Q&A discussion. It might seem like a wild flight of fancy by the Israeli culture minister whom Bell mentioned when he suggested in a radio interview in November that nuclear weapons were one way of dealing with Gaza. Those were his words I'm quoting. And as risible as that idea of dropping a nuclear weapon on your own doorstep might seem, Israel possesses tactical nuclear weapons. And should Iran become directly involved, who's to say that Israel won't consider using nuclear weapons? The prospect of a war in the Middle East is one aspect of Gaza that we'll be discussing this afternoon, and I'm not going to say much more about that issue because it's the subject of an entire panel discussion later. But what I will say is it will be very interesting to hear what atomic scientists have to say when they reset the doomsday clock for 2024, which is due to take place in just over a week's time. Last year it was set at a few minutes to midnight, which is the greatest danger of the use of nuclear weapons since the Second World War. So let's see what's coming up in 2024, according to the technical experts. Now more than ever, we need the peace movement on high mobilisation and on the streets of Britain, and congratulations to every one of us who attends those magnificent demonstrations in support of Gaza. Britain's deeply committed to Ukraine and Israel. The British government, I should say, is deeply committed to Ukraine and Israel. And as nuclear threats grow, we, Britain, are involved in three ways. First of all, Britain is a member of NATO, a nuclear first strike alliance, which means our nuclear weapons could be committed to any nuclear engagement by NATO. The United States is the only nuclear weapons state which situates its nukes outside its own territory. US nuclear facilities are located across the world, and there are 7 US nuclear bases in Europe. Second, 2 years ago, CND learned that Britain had become the 8th US nuclear weapons facility in Europe. American nukes will be returning to Lakenheath in Sussex. The fighter jets to deliver them across the world are already in place in Lakenheath, and that paints a target on the back of everyone in this country, just as cruise missiles did in the 1980s, and we'll be hearing more about that in detail from Emma shortly. And third, I wanted to mention not the possibility of conflict, but of a nuclear accident arising from Britain's Trident system. Little attention is given to nuclear accidents, but Bell mentioned a risk, a danger that took place only a month ago. I want to mention 2 others. In January last year, inspectors found a defect on one of the nuclear submarines whilst undergoing a maintenance check. You'll find a record on the CND website that a nuclear Navy submarine completing a record-breaking tour of 6 months of the year at sea has added considerably to safety concerns for Britain's Trident system. And around the same time, the Times newspaper reported that an unnamed vessel had been spotted, and I quote, encrusted with barnacles and covered in slime in the Faslane naval base in Scotland. And it said, the Times reported, that that vessel had been on patrol at sea for in excess of 6 months. And then less than 2 months later, in November, the media reported an incident on board a Vanguard-class submarine, which Bell mentioned in her introduction, about a malfunction whilst diving, which meant that the submarine was headed towards its crush depth before the alarm was raised. And you can imagine from the name that the crush depth means that the submarine is crushed. The people are killed, people on board, the submariners are killed, and the possibility of nuclear weapons escaping and or exploding becomes. So the danger of accidental problems should not be forgotten, in my opinion. Something that we might be less aware of at this point, this year Britain is set to renew the US-UK Mutual Defence Agreement. It's a bilateral agreement first signed in the 1950s, 1958 from memory, which gives the UK access to American nuclear know-how and other nuclear necessities in return for intelligence sharing. What does it mean? The RAF Menwith Hill near Harrogate is one of the most vital of all US bases overseas. Like Lakenheath, in reality, it's operated and controlled by the US military. In the case of Menwith Hill, by the National Security Agency, which is responsible, as people know, for intelligence activities and surveillance. Menwith Hill operates beyond public scrutiny and accountability. It's almost totally secret, in fact, and it allows NASA, it allows the NSA to intercept military and commercial communications and carry out all sorts of illegal spying activities. It enables the US to carry out targeted killings, such as those that took place in Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11, for example. And we don't know what role it may or may not be playing in what's going on today. The second base in Yorkshire, RAF Fylingdales, is a listening post on the North Yorkshire Moors. It's one of 3 stations which comprise the US ballistic missile early warning system. It detects and identifies intercontinental ballistic missiles targeted on the US or on the UK. It's what many of us will remember this. It's what the government called the 4-minute warning during the Cold War. Information from Fylingdales could be responsible for initiating a nuclear response by the US or Britain to a perceived nuclear threat that might arise in Ukraine war, for example. It could also be responsible for wrongly identifying such a threat, and those wrong identifications of nuclear attacks happened several times during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. There's much more detail on Yorkshire CND website about Menwith Hill and Fylingdales for people who want to follow that up. But what I want to say, make no mistake, nuclear weapons are at the heart of the so-called special relationship between the US and Britain. Now, I appreciate that CND activists in our audience will be well aware of Menwith Hill and Fylingdales, but what bears repeating is that the contemporary context brings these 2 listening posts, spy bases, back into focus. It tells us that not only does the Mutual Defence Agreement make Britain dependent on US nuclear technology and tie us into the industrial military complex and so forth, but it also makes clear that MDA exercises a much broader influence, basically tying Britain in to US foreign and security policy. And that's something we need to be very aware of with the prospect of two extremely serious wars looming in the world. There's much more to be said about how CND works and what we're doing, and I can't cover that in the short time I've got. For instance, I particularly wanted to mention developments around AUKUS, which are ongoing. We've covered this a couple of times recently in London CND annual conferences, the impacts on China and relations in the in the area, and it also there is talk at the moment about the expansion of that treaty. Japan wants to be involved, New Zealand wants to be involved, and that seems to me a very threatening development which we should focus on in future and in the coming year. And not least amongst the impacts of nuclear weapons on things that are taking place is the impact of nuclear on climate, which Sam is going to be covering a bit later on, and which she's written about extensively. Some people will be aware of her material. Hopefully we'll be able to put that in the chat as the session goes on. So nuclear weapons are at the heart of US foreign policy. They're at the heart of British foreign policy and British support for NATO. They're not an optional extra. They're not a dim and distant threat that we all face in the background of these turbulent international events that are taking place. Our message is they must be of concern to all of us engaged in international solidarity and in peace and justice activities. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Carol. I'm going to pass over to our second panellist now, but before I do, let me just remind you all that you are welcome to pose questions. There is a special chat box. You should see it at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It says Q&A. Please feel free to post a question to the panel there, and we will do our best to get to it. We have 20 minutes for questions. I'm going to hand over to Emma Dent-Coad now, who is going to speak with us about US nukes in our area, Lakenheath. Emma, over to
Hello,
you.
it says my video has been stopped by the host. Can someone switch me back on, please?
Sorry, Emma, we'll try and sort that out immediately. We can hear you at least, though.
Oh.
You should be able to turn on now, Emma.
Okay, no, it's okay. Yes, here I am. Hello. Thank you very much. I do want to commend the excellent speech by Belle. What an amazing advocate for her constituents, but also for all the movements that she supports, and particularly this one. I'm absolutely delighted that she's on the parliamentary CND, as I was when I was in Parliament. I've heard many descriptions of the UK's relationship with the US as bag carrier or sepoy. I didn't know what that was actually, quisling or butler. None of them are really satisfactory. But the reality is, if we wish to view ourselves as partners with the US, we are very much the junior partner. The narrative being played that by associating ourselves with the US, we're still some kind of world superpower, apparently has to be maintained at all costs, at cost of our lives, I presume. But this is a complete illusion, and it is very, very dangerous for us. Our former EU partners deride us. Our economy is in a mess. We've lost forever the image that we had of, however false it may have been, of decency, integrity, fairness, and decent welfare. All of that has gone. And I know from speaking to family, but also our EU constituents, how our stock has fallen drastically. This very real possibility of the US reusing Lakenheath and Suffolk as a nuclear weapons arsenal because they had previously had weapons there, along with the 6,000 US personnel who are stationed there, puts us in the front line to launch a potential nuclear attack, working with NATO, and we won't have any, we won't be able to argue that one. We will have to literally press the button alongside them. This is hugely dangerous for our relatively small, heavily populated island. We make ourselves a very easy target for any retaliatory action. At just 100 miles from London, this is a risk we really can't afford. In addition, we need to consider the many errors that we've been hearing about, but also the two accidents that took place at Lakenheath in 1956 and 61, where US investigators said it was an absolute miracle that a bomb hadn't been detonated. And if it had, it would have turned East England into a desert. Possibilities of error involving the death of millions are very real. So while the presence of these weapons of genocide have not been confirmed yet, the recent visits by the US Defense Secretary and planned updates to the site's infrastructure point to this being imminent. We must believe that this is going to happen soon. We cannot, of course, rely on the likely incoming Labour government to resist, I'm sorry to say. The Labour leader has already made it clear that when it comes to issues of defence, national security of the country, we seek to work with the Tories, basically, and that will mean with US policy. That's no surprise, but it's still pretty depressing. So what can we do? As we've been hearing, we support every single local CND action, and over the years we have made a difference. I remember visiting Greenham Common all those years ago, and that works. Mass action does work, and we must never ever let anybody tell us that it's a waste of time, because it really isn't. It does make a difference, and it gets the information out. Read, inform ourselves, and disseminate factual information. There's a lot of disinformation out there, and we must make sure that the facts get out there. And we must be very, very aware of the very clever rhetorical games played by these superpowers involved in this global chess game, where ordinary people are considered as pawns, collateral, expendable, as we've been hearing in the language around the assault on Gaza by the Israeli state. The lies and disinformation spread are finally being called out. I have seen some TV interviewers and other commentators actually picking apart the narrative and picking apart the rhetoric, and we have to be sure that more people can do that and actually see through the lies to the truth behind it. So as we've been hearing, and others have mentioned about this, the money that has been found when we have millions starving, and our schools falling apart and our buildings falling apart, the money that can be found to support these so-called deterrents, they're not deterrents, they are attracting problems to us. It's absolutely terrifying. While our own population goes cold and hungry, we're spending, is it 30 billion still on updating Trident, which we've heard a bit about already. And heaven only knows hundreds of billions that the US is spending to lodge this nuclear arsenal within range of Eastern Europe. Oh, God help us, what on earth is happening? Middle East, then Eastern Europe, are we all going to be at war? So we're playing Russian roulette with the lives of our own people and the millions of innocent civilians who would perish in a nuclear war. Not to mention the effect on the climate, which is already, as we know, in peril. I'm going to end soon. You may hear I've got a filthy cold and I can't speak too much longer without sniffling. I do apologize. So I just want to say, if it goes any further, as has happened now, it won't affect the leaders. They'll be in their bunkers. They'll be fine. It'll be us, the ordinary people outside who have spoken out, who will perish. And we are just unfortunate collateral. So we need an informed, very savvy and active public to fight this. And we know CND are incredible. They have such excellent narratives and advertising and messages going out all the time. We must have absolutely no acceptance of nuclear weapons in Lakenheath Please mobilise and join whatever actions you can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Sam Mason, who's going to be talking more about war and climate change. Thank you, Emma. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Hannah. And yeah, thanks to all the other speakers. It's a real privilege to be on this panel as usual and to be following those. And I really thank CND for putting the issue of climate change firmly on its agenda. So I am, as Hannah said, going to talk about the relationship or impacts between climate change and war. Now, if I don't always expressly mention it, nuclear weapons, of course, are very much included within this. So as has already been pointed out, obviously we're in a perilous state in terms of climate change. So just to roll back a little bit, in July 2023, it was announced as the hottest month on record for the globe. And at that time, the UN General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, said we had entered a new era of global boiling. Now, he emphasised what many of us already recognise, but of course not everybody agrees with, the number of climate change deniers out there, that climate change is here. It is terrifying, and it is just the beginning. So what we're seeing in terms of the horrifying scenes of floods, wildfires, droughts, and so on, that unfortunately are now regularly shown across our TV screens, is the new reality. These are not one-off events. This is what is going to continue to happen. And in the UK, we've just gone through 8 storms, I think it is, in 4 months, which of course has caused extensive flooding and damage to homes and infrastructure such as power cables and so on. I'm sure you've all have seen just this past week that 2023 has been confirmed as the hottest year on record. Again, that's globally. And the thing about this, it's not just that records are being broken, they are being shattered. They are being broken by margins that have even shocked some of the climate scientists in terms of their modelling and where they expected us to be by now. Now, the UN and others continue to call for path-breaking action and to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to accelerate the transition to renewable energy. But the reality, and what's often referred to as the kind of sort of gold standard of the 2015 Paris climate talks, of holding annual average global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, is now teetering on the brink, and we're likely to break through that on a more regular basis this year alone. So the prospects of sort of where we're heading on this isn't great. And of course, we've just had the climate talks in Dubai, which were dominated by the fossil fuel sector, and they're going to be held again in Azerbaijan next year, again another heavy fossil fuel state as well. So they have been particularly captured by the fossil fuel and oil sectors. Of course, against this backdrop of climate change, we've got an increased militarization and wars, not least the deadly war on Gaza and all the impacts that's having, and what is seen as the silent elephant in the room of climate talks. So if we've entered a new era of global boiling, we've also, as the Financial Times recently wrote in an editorial, entered a new era of global warfare. And there's some 4 or 5 key reasons why we have to be really concerned, obviously, about the links between climate change and wars, and how wars are themselves a threat to addressing climate change, or what climate activists call the nexus between militarism, and as I said, that includes nuclear weapons and climate change. Now, the first of those is carbon emissions, both in the production and the operations of countries' military warfare. So countries don't have to disclose their military emissions as part of the UN accounting process for greenhouse gas emissions, and it's estimated that globally military emissions contribute towards 4.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's generally seen the bigger the military spend, the bigger they contribute. So the US, for example, is seen to be as the world's largest institutional consumer of emissions and produces the equivalent to a country the size of Denmark or Portugal. And of course, the impacts of climate change themselves heighten the risk of confrontations and hostilities, not least with access to scarce resources, for example, water. And we're seeing countries like Iraq now, which are suffering terribly, obviously, from the impacts of the invasions we saw there in the past years, and now access to water and real water scarcity, and obviously the movements of peoples and displacement due to climate change. And we know we're in a very hostile environment, not just in the UK, but globally in terms of refugees and what's becoming seen as climate refugees as well. Now, of course, wars impact on infrastructure, and they, of course, leave behind masses of environmental damage where the toxicity of bombed sites take years to recover, and make that fragile infrastructure even more vulnerable to climate change impacts. And again, this is something we saw in Libya last year in September, in Dernia, where the two dams broke and caused extensive flooding and loss of thousands of life. And again, a country that had been subject to those invasions and wars in the past years as well. And of course, I think sort of Emma spoke to some of this in her presentations around. Now, of course, a nuclear attack would be the ultimate in climate devastation as well. The other issue is the diversion of resources from addressing climate change. This manifests itself in areas such as what are discussed at the climate talks in loss and damage funds or other climate finance for particularly vulnerable countries, and notably those who have done least to contribute towards climate change. And to just put this in some perspective, the UK committed to contribute a paltry £60 million of an overall £700 million that was committed at the COP Dubai talks just this past December. And that is 0.2% of what is estimated countries need just within loss and damage funds. Now, to put that in perspective, as others have already mentioned, Sunak has now just been able to rustle up 2.5 billion in military aid for Ukraine in the next year. So this is how seriously they take the impacts of climate change and what we need to be addressing in this area. The other issue, of course, is around jobs. Not only does war, of course, destroy livelihoods, but in contradiction, it also ensures money for defence sector jobs, which sadly, as we know, in the case of the UK, TUC is supported by trade unions, and again, detracts from the work we need to be doing around decarbonisation and, to some extent, our own adaptation needs. And not least, it generates vast profits for defence contractors off the back of taxpayer money. And I think last and most certainly not least, it's about climate justice. And if we're talking about just transition, justice has to be around justice for all peoples and oppressed peoples, and ensuring that human rights are respected and people can live in dignity and be part of creating their own solutions in terms of the climate crisis, and having access to the means and funds to do that. And this has become a really important issue in terms of Gaza and Palestine, and some of you be aware there's been quite a split in the climate justice movement about support for Palestine and whether it's a legitimate issue. Even people like Greta Thunberg have been heavily attacked for speaking obviously in support of Palestine, and the need to call for an immediate ceasefire, and so on. Now, so whilst there are many peace activists who are climate activists and vice versa, as that just highlights, we don't necessarily sit together, and often don't sit together in the same room and having these discussions. And we cannot have one discussion without the other. It's not enough just to call for renewable energy to resolve the climate crisis. We need justice, and we need to end wars, and we need to have peace as well. So it's time to change that. And I think, as Belle said in her contribution, it's time to change that and fight for the world that we want to see. And that's one, obviously, through nuclear weapons, one which is based on peace, and one which enables us all to move together and address the many huge issues that we've got around our health sectors, around our welfare services, around our general social protections, and fight for a better and peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that important talk. Whilst our participants gather together questions, we have 15 minutes for a Q&A. Please do type them into the chat box. I'll just draw your attention to a couple of comments that we have received. Sophie from National CND draws our attention to CND's campaign against US nukes coming to Britain, featured in a BBC Panorama documentary, which will be airing next Thursday. That's on the 18th of January, 9 p.m. on BBC Two. So that's a BBC Panorama documentary on Thursday, 9 p.m. BBC Two. Sophie says it will really help to raise awareness of this nuclear threat and recruit new supporters to our campaign. Please do watch and encourage others to do so. She's popped a link into the chat, so you're welcome to have a look at that. We also have a question here from Alan. Alan tells us that he is aged 84. Congratulations, Alan, but that he has been a CND member since he was 17.
Wow.
So congratulations, Alan, for your long-standing membership, perhaps the longest-standing membership on this call. Alan draws our attention towards a booklet. I'm not sure if our panelists know this one. It's called Militarism Fuels Climate Crisis. And what Alan is asking is, where do we have parliamentary or party manifestos support and promotion of this? And what could we do to improve this? Do any of our panelists have any views that they'd like to share on this? How do we get parliamentary support for some of the things we're talking about? Emma, thank you.
Yeah, having excuse me, having been in Parliament, and one of the things I've been making mistakes myself. I realise sending briefings about Grenfell, which I do every year. They have a Grenfell debate, and I send briefings. One of the things I have personally been guilty of, and I really should know, is that when you send briefings out, you need to make a brief briefing and then a longer briefing, because otherwise nobody will read it. And it seems so simple, but you have to literally have half a page with bullet points of things which really will mean something which will smack you in the face, because we get daily piles and piles of fascinating things, which if there were three of us, we would never be able to get through. I mean, 3 MPs, 3 Emmas, and just to make it digestible. And so that we can actually filter through all the amazing information that we get is absolutely huge. And that's one thing. It seems really minor, but it's important to bring the information to them, not to make people hunt for it. And I will certainly be doing better in future when I'm sending out my own briefings. But that is one thing. Events are good. People will send their staff probably if they're busy. But to have parliamentary events, but just basic factual stuff. This is what it costs. This is how many people it could kill. This is what, all this, that kind of thing, which some parties are really good at, kind of breaking down. You can get so many nurses for this and all the rest of it. That's really helpful. Sort of debate points and so on. And that's just one issue. There's plenty of other ideas, I'm sure. But one thing is make it easy for the MPs, because we are bombarded with stuff.
Make the briefings briefer. Wonderful. Very good practical advice, Emma. Thank you very much. Sam or Carol?
People might not know is that CND has quite an active and engaged parliamentary group, which both Belle and Emma mentioned. Emma is a former vice chair, Belle, the current vice chair. There's more than one vice chair. There's a Labour vice chair, a Plaid Cymru vice chair, a SNP vice chair, a Green vice chair, and so on. It's a cross-party and all-party group. And that's quite important, because there are certain things that different parties focus on, which gives CND that sort of breadth. So the Scottish Nationalists will focus on Trident and Faslane. The Green Party will focus on their issues, and so on. And I think if you want to make suggestions or raise issues, then one of the best things you can do is contact National CND, write to the CND office and put your suggestions in a short email, which can be passed to the appropriate person who's servicing that group. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. Sam, did you want to chip in on this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I was just going to come back to Alan's point about the booklet on militarism fuels climate crisis. Yeah, I am aware of that. There is thankfully quite a bit more literature around today than there has been on this, and there is increasing convergence of groups growing to discuss this and raise it within the climate talks, even if at the moment that is on the sidelines, unfortunately. But at least there are groups going to the COP, groups like Scientists for Global Responsibility, for example, who many of you will be aware of, and Stuart Parkinson's work as well, and linking up. And we've got some global networks now, some European-wide networks as well. So I think it's important to just keep raising this continuously. In terms of the parliamentary or party manifesto side, I think others are covered, but this is for those who are politically involved, not just in obviously the Labour Party, but other groups, is to raise this and make sure you get motions through your own political processes, and of course within the wider Labour movement. I mentioned about the TUC Congress motion of a couple of years ago supporting increased defence spending, and we've got to continually make those links, because it's a nonsense that we're passing motions on climate change and the threat to jobs, and on the same hand we're saying, but that's okay if you want to invest 3% of GDP into defence sector jobs, and some of that money obviously that Rishi Sunak has just committed to. The main reference I've seen to it at the moment is around drones production, will be going into UK manufacturing jobs, and these are not the jobs we want to be arguing for. So we continually have got to make the links between these things and raise it through any means which we can. And of course there are a number of unions who are affiliated to the Labour Party, and so need to be getting motions through there and using whichever channels we can to raise politically as well, within sort of more socially in the discussions and campaign meetings that we're in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sam. We have a question in the chat from Mark Morgan, which I understand as Mark is drawing our attention to the fact that, of course, it's very important that we demonstrate against our own government, but that also we should be vocal about the other governments who also hold nuclear weapons. And Mark's question is about totalitarian regimes and whether or not we should be vocal and criticise them, or should we hesitate? I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts about, I'm trying to link this, perhaps more directly back to some of the discussions that we're having about the importance, not just of protesting against UK nuclear weapons and what's happening on our soil, but more globally.
Well, I'd say two things, if I may, Hannah. The first is, if you are a campaigning movement on a single issue, as CND is, nuclear disarmament is our main and prime objective. The objective is global nuclear disarmament, but I think most of us on this call would recognise that the possession of nuclear weapons promotes proliferation by other states who feel that they need to have their own to get in on the act, as it were. So the first job of any organisation in our position is to campaign and put pressure on what our government should be doing. And that's what CND does every day, religiously, year after year, month after month, week after week. I think CND has got an extremely good record on this, and it's recognised across the world. It doesn't mean to say that we don't comment or take positions on what other governments do, but what we recognise is that it's not our job to devise, if you like, nuclear disarmament strategies for countries that we're not engaged in, that we're not living in. So, for example, CND was prominent along with Stop the War and others, in calling at the outset of the Ukraine war, in not only calling for a process of peace talks, but in opposing Russia's possession of nuclear weapons and opposing Russia's invasion. But the point that the practical matter is that every organisation's resources are limited compared to government resources, and we have to direct our resources where they're best aimed. I noticed that Mark mentioned China in his rather long question, and CND's view is that there is a developing Cold War between China and the West. We would call for nuclear disarmament by all nuclear possessing powers. That includes China as well as Russia, as well as Britain, as well as America, as well as France, Israel, etc. But we also recognise that that is not something that is within our power to effectively campaign for. We comment on these things from time to time. And I think one of the contributions that CND will increasingly be making in the debate around Gaza and the Middle East is, first of all, to highlight the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons, and secondly, to reiterate what for us is a very long-standing call, which is for a nuclear-free Middle East. And if anything, we'll begin to diffuse the tensions within the Middle East. I think getting rid of Israel's nuclear weapons and abandoning Iran's nuclear project, is a primary contribution. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Carol, for that. I wanted to draw your attention to the chat where we have Carol has posted a link to Sam's pamphlet, which is titled Labour, Climate Change and Nuclear Power, Not Cheap, Not Safe, Not Peaceful. So you can download and read that booklet online.
Good afternoon. I hope everyone's managed to get themselves a cup of tea or coffee during the break for the second part of our London CND conference. Can I just remind you, tomorrow we have our AGM in the evening, and I think this is a very useful exercise before tomorrow's AGM. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about the prospects for the occupied territories, and we've got a number of speakers lined up after our main speaker. So I'll get on with introducing our main speaker, who in many ways doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'll give him a brief one. He's a Gaza boy himself who's lost relatives in the recent massacre and onslaught in Gaza. He's been one of the best, most eloquent speakers for the Palestinians in the recent turmoil for the Palestinians. And we saw him yesterday speaking at the rally at Parliament Square. It's none other than the ambassador for London, Hussam Zamlot. Hussam Zamlot, can I give you the floor right now?
I think you're going to find that he's not on the call yet.
Sorry, okay.
I've just sent them a message saying we're waiting for them.
Okay, well,
what I suggest is let's if you want to say a few words, please do. But if so, let's just get on with the panel and we all join him up to the panel when he arrives.
Okay, well then let's do that. The in the second plenary we've got 3 speakers, Raghad, Sami, and Jenny. Our first speaker on the impact on the war on Gaza will talk about the humanitarian situation and the need for solidarity. She is the chair of the Muslim Association of Britain, Raghad Altikriti. Can I give you the floor?
Thank you, Murad. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Chair, sisters and brothers, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. It's a pleasure being with you today, and I'd like to thank CND for organizing this conference, which comes at a time when the world has seen the 100th day of a complete genocide being committed against the people of Gaza. It's been over 21 years since MAB and CND have been allies, and we look forward to many, many more years of working together for the cause of peace, justice, and humanity. We are all overjoyed, of course, after yesterday's glorious turnout around the globe in more than 40 countries, which will no doubt go down in history as one of the most important. Important not because our country achieved a military conquest, important not because we secured a lucrative energy deal, important not because we won at the Eurovision or at the European Championship. Yesterday will go down as a significant day in the history of our nation and nations across the globe, because the people of our country and other countries stood tall, shouted loud, and stated clearly that they reject injustice, inhumanity, discrimination, racism, and criminality, whoever is the perpetrator and whoever happens to be the victim. For that, we can all stand proud today. These are critical times, and it is important to see the events through a humanitarian lens. We are witnessing a series of war crimes against the people of Palestine. Call it what you want to call it, a genocide, a massacre, a wipeout. It is a series of brutal criminal action committed live, right in front of our eyes, with superpowers supporting, defending, and arming the perpetrators of such hideous crimes, granting them immunity from accountability and punishment, and giving them authorization to unleash continued aggression against Palestinians. At this stage, we have seen it all. No kind of brutality has been left to be committed by Israel. We have seen body parts of children in bags, smashed skulls, mothers bidding farewell to their babies, families seeking refuge and being directly shot at and murdered, families buried under the rubble of their homes, children amputated and maimed, journalists, medics, civil servants targeted and murdered. We have seen the brutality of the situation unfolding in Palestine for 100 days, and still they have to fight and struggle to convince people and governments around the world that what is happening is a genocide and is a crime against Palestinians. We, as supporting organizations, have to fight against the accusations and tarnishing for standing up for Palestine. Palestinians have shown us their pain, their wounds, their destroyed homes, streets and city, the bodies of their family members who passed away, the attacks, the constant bombings, the intimate minutes of the Palestinians mourning, their children traumatized and shaking. They shared the scenes and the noises of the massacres and they are subjected to day and night. But yet, they are questioned and shelved under the right of Israel to defend itself in the most brutal of ways. This stance towards the genocide is baffling and inhumane. These testing times expose those who claim to stand for justice, freedom, and humanity, but are acting upon their belief that justice, freedom, and humanity are the rights of some and not the others. This is deeply troubling, and the first action is to confront ourselves, families, and communities. Make sure that you believe those rights belong to all, regardless of who they are, regardless of their ethnic minority, class, religion, color, and background. As fellow human beings, we should seek to stand up for the rights and freedom of all humans. Anything else would be double standards and not worthy of pursuing, and will belittle our actions in our struggle, claiming that we are human rights defenders and justice lovers. Make no mistake, my dear friends. Standing in solidarity with the people of Gaza amid a crime being committed against them by our government, amongst others, in our name, with the help of our taxes, is not for their sake. For they have given everything, literally everything, to stand against occupation, injustice, and inhumanity. No, our stand in solidarity with Gaza is very much for our sake, for our sanity, for our future, for a world which we seek, a world where justice and human rights prevail. When 10, 20, 50 or 100 years from today, our children and grandchildren read their history books and read about a long-gone state of occupation which claimed the lives of several generations of Palestinians and attempted to literally wipe out 2.5 million civilians under our noses and with our support, they will also learn that their parents and grandparents stood firmly and said no. So our stand of solidarity is not merely to show our brothers and sisters in Gaza that they are far from alone in their moments of desperate need. It is a stand which we grasp with all our might for the very last call of hope for freedom and liberation for all the oppressed, all the subjugated, all the downtrodden throughout history all over the world. Friends, as we speak, remarkably, yet another military escapade is happening, and which our government is fully involved. When the mightiest, richest, most affluent states in the world unleash a military act against the poorest, most deprived, most impoverished, most crisis-ridden in the world, we must stand and ask what on earth is wrong with this, which we call the international order. How can we allow the world to be run by such warmongering, war-hungry individuals who threaten us, threaten our world, and threaten our futures? How can we accept such hypocrisy, which one day holds international conferences costing hundreds of millions to discuss climate change and the damage to our environment, and which the very next days drops thousands and thousands of tons of missile, iron, and fire from the skies to obliterate entire swaths of land and kill countless innocent people. I stand with you today to declare to you that we are in desperate need for a radical change. We need a change of government, obviously, but that's only the first step. We need a radical change in the way the world is run. We need a radical change to the entire international global order, which has seen the weapons industry at the lead of every other industry. The fact that the most successful human endeavor today is to kill is a truly horrific prospect, and we must take a stand and change the way the world is. Friends, sisters, and brothers, the first step is to free Palestine. The next mission is to free ourselves and free the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very passionate contribution, Raghad, and the need for solidarity, which we've shown yesterday and will have to continue to undoubtedly. I'm particularly impressed with what South Africans have done for the Palestinians on Thursday when they put that devastating case up in the International Criminal Justice Court in The Hague. And I trust we will continue in our solidarity with the Palestinian plight as events unfold, very unfortunately, and also the need for humanitarian aid. We have the month of fasting soon. I suspect during that month there will be a lot of zakat given to the Palestinians. I just hope paths are made for that to be allowed to happen. Our next two speakers in this session are people that I suspect CND members in London certainly are familiar with. I'm just trying to make sure, is Jenny here and Sami here?
I am. Hello.
Okay, I'll go to you then, Jenny, first. Jenny, hi Jenny. Jenny is our next speaker. She's talking giving us a Jewish perspective, as she's from Jews for Justice for Palestinians, and she's also co-chair for Jewish Voices for Labour. Jenny, the floor's yours.
Thank you. It's Jewish Voice for Labour.
Sorry, did I say voices? Yes, I did it. Yeah.
Okay, quite right. Okay. Well, as many of you know, I am Jewish, and I am English. Both of which are relevant to my criticisms of Britain that have kind of come up. My connection with Israel comes from my mother, who lived in Palestine between 1919 and 1929 when her family escaped a pogrom in Russia. She came to England aged 15 and later married my father, an English Jew. There was little religion at home, but a lot of talk of Jewishness and almost no talk of Zionism, the word or its meanings. But as others will have heard me say, at the news of the Sabra and Shatila massacre in Lebanon in September 1982, my father lost all hope in Israel. That's a bit of background. Like all of you, my level of distress and anger is beyond bearing with Israel. How has it come about that Israel has murdered approximately 24,000 people, about 70% of which are women and children, with immunity? and with many of their own population in Israel hiding themselves behind their own propaganda, incurious about and resistance to news from outside journalists, those that haven't been killed in action, and to dissenting voices in Israel. How come that in Israel, they still consider themselves the good guys? Hamas and its allies can be blamed for everything, including the huge death rate in Gaza and the murders on the West Bank, many by settlers aided by the army. What I'm trying to do in this speech is to try and work out how this could be happening. So let's start with the UK government, whose bombing assault will not stop the Houthi attacks on cargo ships in the Red Sea. And these attacks, I fear, will distract from what Israel is doing in Gaza and will be used to justify their bombings. Rishi Sunak and David Cameron call this self-defense. Israeli spokesmen are already using previous actions by the West, such as Dresden in 1945, as a justification. But whatever is said about these historic parallels, all should remember that Israel is effectively an occupying power, killing the people who they should be protecting. This is not a two-sided war. Can I quote Yasmin Alabaya Brown on Twitter? So the US and UK punish Yemen to protect goods on ships and do nothing to protect Palestinian civilians. This is their moral universe. So overnight, some of you might know, Netanyahu has said, no one will stop us, not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anyone else. But what is very important to remember is that although the alliance with the far right, notably Smotrich and Ben Gvir, is new, Netanyahu's government is a symptom of a long-term move to the right in Israel. Too many people, some Jews and some others, hide behind their opposition to this Netanyahu government instead of engaging in what has gone so terribly wrong in Israel. Netanyahu, as I say, is just a symptom. In recent years, I've been told, only 10% of Israelis consider the occupation and the settlements are illegal, unjust, and should be brought to an end. Even the word occupation is no longer used. This mindset is bolstered by the unquestioning support from the US and the West, which I'm going to come to later. It's buoyed up, I'm afraid, by the misuse of the Holocaust. Now, those of us who know about the Holocaust and those of us who had relatives dying there know that you should never, ever misuse an outrage, a horrific episode like the Holocaust to justify anything done by its victims at any time. By the very successful conflation of anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which I'll say something about later, these have given Israel a self-belief that enables them to abandon any sense that they have an obligation to the Palestinians. There were a lot of Jews speaking up, as you probably know. Daniel Makava, son of the famous Moshe Makava, who is a lawyer, had a conversation with Owen Jones, and he talked of a fundamental failure of the Israelis to look in the mirror and understand their positive duty to seek a way for the Palestinians to seek self-determination. Instead, back to me, overtly or not, Israelis, not just the government, have largely abandoned any real belief in progress to full rights for Palestine. Talk of two states and one state solutions, as you all know, is pie in the sky. There is no conversation seriously about a solution. And the alternative is what I'm beginning to fear, is that to destroy the Palestinian aspirations, you destroy them. You destroy them in Gaza and the West Bank through death, through wounding, through homelessness, through disease, through starvation and through expulsion. And many who can are fleeing. That sort of solves Israel's problems. Now, we know that many Israelis considered they were traumatized by the events of October 7th. They lost their sense of inviolability. This does pose a huge moral dilemma to those of us, Jewish or not Jewish, who want to be fair to what Israel is feeling. Norman Finkelstein, I don't know if you saw him, attempted to dissect his feelings about the breakthrough of the barrier by Hamas, which delighted him when they broke through, followed by some undoubted atrocities. And one of the comparisons he made is to the reaction to the riot of Nat Turner's, a slave in 1831 in America. This is an incident that shook the confidence of the oppressors and led to a terrible clampdown, a worse clampdown on the rights of Jews. I do want to mention that there are counter views in Israel, particularly the journal 972. I don't know if people read it. It's a wonderful journal, which I support in every way. 2 quick quotes on the day or so after October the 7th, one written on October 7th itself. Haggai Matai wrote, "As I write these words, I'm sitting at home in Tel Aviv trying to figure out how to protect my family. Yet I remember that everything that I'm feeling now, which every Israeli must be sharing, has been the life experience of millions of Palestinians for far too long." Then another editor, Orly Noor, wrote, "But our humanity is exactly what is being put to the test. Hamas attacks fill many Israelis with existential fear, but morality is never a privilege. It isn't an indulgent. In other words, we have to immediately, as she argued, think constructively and not go in for revenge. But the majority view, as you know, is a denial that atrocities are even happening. And it's expressed by their spokespeople. They sound cruel to me, not just bad and wrong, but cruel. They counter all accusations with accusations against Hamas or all its supporters, e.g. the UN. They ask us to mourn their soldiers dying in Gaza. Well, actually, I mourn all such deaths, but this is crazy stupid because they're not ignoring what most of the populations of the world are thinking. Most Israelis do not read Haaretz. You might know about Haaretz. It covered the Court of Justice in The Hague very well. They don't even watch the BBC. They've been told it's anti-Semitic. They have a satirical episode every week of sort of mock the BBC. They watch and they re-watch filming of what happened on the 7th of October, sometimes all channels, 24 hours a day. But this is my next question. How come they can carry this oblivion? And it's the support for Palestinians from the US and the UK in particular, and much of the West, has given them total immunity. This is not new, but Biden's comments on the 7th of October that the US will never ever fail to have Israel's back put into words a notion that the death of Israeli citizens is heinous, quite different from the killing of Palestinians. And Israel called their bombardment of Gaza self-defense. Some might have heard Daniel Levy, president of the US Middle East Project, not originally thought of for his radical ideas, but in the first days after 7th of October, I heard him take the BBC interview to task. He said, "It is not self-defense. Don't lie," he said. But leaving aside all the conversations about settler, colonial, imperialist, capitalist analysis to others, I am finding myself troubling over the psychological angle of this blanket support. I fear that what has been said before is that abused people become abusers. Victims never lose that sense of victimhood. And this is propped up by this carte blanche from the US. So today, I am frightened of a world war. I'm frightened of Israeli actions and those of the US and the UK, and I'm frightened of anti-Semitism, real anti-Semitism, because given the conflation of Israel and Jews cultivated by Israel and political parties here, I think hatred for Israel will be translated into hatred for Jews. But most of all, of course, I watch what's happening in Gaza with utter horror. I find it very hard to sleep at the moment. I think that's common of many people. I've not known a 3 months like this. Back to kind of earth a moment about Jewish Voice for Labour. I'm active in Jews for Justice for Palestinians, but mainly in JVL. I want to say something about the failure of people on the left and of the continuing of the mainstream media, including The Guardian, to recognise that the false allegations against Jeremy Corbyn and so many of us are very dangerous for Palestinians. That's what's led, in some cases, to Israel's success in conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Israel views. There is now a clampdown in the Labour Party for even discussing a ceasefire. My colleague Richard Cooper, some of you will know, asked for a debate in his own constituencies, Keir Starmer's, to be told that there are to be no debates on a ceasefire. There wasn't a word of criticism of Israel in that wording of his careful motion, just asking for a ceasefire. Yes, you probably know Jewish Voice for Labour fights rather alone on this. And I feel that there's a moral cowardice on behalf of the people who recognise what's happening in Israel and Palestine now. not to come clean about what the Labour Party did in terrifying too many people from its midst, including Jews like us. I wanted to end with something more positive. At least to me, it's quite positive. There were some retired diplomats I worked with in Israel. One of them was Alon Liel. People might have heard of him. They did suffer that trauma. They argued with me to some extent. He did, on what Israel's immediate task was after the 7th of October. But you may know these retired diplomats and lawyers have written to the Attorney General in Israel, challenging those terrible expressions of intended genocide, but even more bravely, what they want is for the court to issue a statement that the ceasefire is required, that to require a ceasefire, because they see, like I see, that the only hope at the moment is America taking some action to restrain Israel. And the view is that if the Security Council receives an order from the International Court of Justice, they will not be able to ignore it. So when people say to me, well, Jenny, what is the solution? You know, the only solution is this terrible killing. I say, I don't know whether the rest of you agree, we need America to change its mind. That's the only obvious route, as far as I can see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for your Jewish perspective on what we've seen for the last few months, and your final comment that we've got to watch what happens in America. My understanding, there's more happening there than we realise, particularly in places like New York. I've got a nephew who's studying there at the moment, and he gave me some insights into that. So far, we've had a kind of Muslim perspective, a Jewish perspective. I think one of the things I would like to point out, I think uniquely, tell me if I'm wrong, but the first time we've heard Christian Palestinians in the forefront of defending Palestinians, whether it be Layla Moran in the House of Commons, or the pastor, Mother Isaacs from Bethlehem, when he did his sermon on Christ under the rubble. I personally, I'm not the type to listen to sermons, but I certainly listened to that one. I've got no doubts it's had a profound effect, as well as Christians in Bethlehem cancelling Christmas this year. So let's not lose that perspective as well when we think of it, when we look at various religious perspectives in the matter and concerns that we all have on Gaza. Our final speaker in this session, plenary session, is someone I'm sure many of us know. He's been an anti-war voice in the UK for the past 20 years at least, an anti-imperialist, Sami Ramadani, and he's an Iraq, and he's talking from an Iraqi Democrats against the war perspective. Sami, can I give you the floor?
Thank you, Murad, and thank you, CND London, for inviting me. I will try to go briefly through the most important consequences of 7 October and focus mainly on the regional impact, but also I will refer briefly to Britain's role in this affair, in this catastrophe that has befallen the people of Gaza. I think one important development has been, and this is for the first time in many, many decades, the Palestinians have taken the initiative. This has put the Palestinian popular movement firmly not only on the agenda, but dictating that agenda. And that is really crucial, that the Palestinians themselves have become at the forefront of the struggle of their own people for liberation and for a peaceful world that they could actually exist and live in. And in that respect, this has come about because of the strengthening of the Palestinian resistance movement. So 7 October has suddenly awakened not only the Arab world, but the whole world, that the Palestinian people have not gone away. that this surface type facade that the Palestinian people are not being active has been blown asunder. In fact, they have not only taken the initiative, but they have become the writers of their own history. And perhaps for the first time since the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, what they have done also is punctured the so-called invincibility of Israel. Israel has been always projected in the Arab world that it's an invincible power, that it has won every war it has engaged in. What few hundred Palestinians did has actually punctured that forever. And Israel did need emergency support from the United States, Britain, other Western powers. Western leaders arrived in Tel Aviv one after the other. They were holding a queue to support Israel. And in fact, all that support and so on was in preparation for a genocidal war. Israel succeeded initially, at least in the first day or two, to mobilize not only Israeli opinion, but part of world opinion against the Palestinian people to justify what had followed and what transpired, which was definitely a genocidal war with a strategic aim of expelling the Palestinian people from their homeland in Gaza. So that has been one important issue to stress. The second one, and that also relates to the cause of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian resistance movement, that for the first time in their history, they have acquired a strategic depth. And that strategic depth was absent because of the role of Arab regimes. Arab regimes have suppressed any sign of support for the Palestinian people amongst the Arab masses. These regimes were installed after the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide the Middle East between France and Britain. And these regimes were tied to colonial rule and semi-colonial rule. And later, when US imperialism took over the region from the old powers, they became vassals of what US imperialism dictated in the region. So the Palestinian people were denied their natural strategic dimension, strategic depth in the Arab world. And this has changed now. And when I say now, it has obviously been developing for the last few years. And that strategic depth has been, the pillar of it has been Lebanon, the resistance in Lebanon. And now Yemen has provided a huge strategic balance of forces changing depth in the emergence of Yemen as a solid backer of the Palestinian cause. Similarly, in Iraq, the Iraqi resistance forces are challenging US presence in both Iraq and Syria. And the Iraqi prime minister himself is now on the record asking for the US forces to leave Iraq. So that again shows the impact of what has happened on 7th of October and how the pressure from the Arab masses is forcing a change across the Arab world. And that change is strategic, is very important. And also it has affected young Arab people. The young were fed defeatism for the last couple of decades. They were fed that Israel is there and that's it, and normalization is what should be done. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and so on, and later to be joined by Saudi Arabia, the most important oil producer in the world, that they were on the agenda to normalize, and defeatism was in the air. And that sudden change has also awakened the Arab young people that Palestine is still there, the people are still there, and they do want freedom, they do want liberation. And that has galvanized the streets from Algeria to Iraq and the Arab world. And in a similar fashion, if we look at the international scene, the Palestinian people have acquired a massive strategic depth in terms of popular support across the world. Again, that affected young people across the world. They have woken up to find that there is a powerful movement in Palestine. The Palestinian people are there and they want their rights, and they have not been wiped out of the earth like the Israelis were hoping. So, and this has also a strategic middle term and long term impact, that this change in world public opinion, especially among the young, will be a very powerful force to be relied upon for the cause of Palestine. This will have material impact on the cause of the Palestinian people and the justice of their cause. So that must be borne in mind. Another important change, and I'm glad Jenny spoke before me, the impact on Jewish opinion. I think there has been a transformative change amongst young Jewish opinion across the world, especially in the United States, especially in New York, where the young have come out with strength to say Zionism is wrong in what it is doing, that the Palestinian people have a cause, and that they need to be supported in their cause. The justice of their cause is very important to uphold, and that again has enormous strategic impact in the future, that it's not some small Jewish minority which has been supporting the Palestinians, but the young people, maybe in their hundreds of thousands, Jewish young people, are also rallying to the cause of the Palestinian people. And Zionism has exposed its ugly face in this genocidal war in Gaza. And that has woken up a lot of young Jewish opinion, that they were fed propaganda, they were fed Zionist lies, and this has been exposed. And what has also been fully exposed is that Israel as a state has become a genocidal state. A number of human rights organizations, including the leading Israeli human rights organization, have declared Israel as an apartheid state. And now with Gaza, the world can also see that this is not only an apartheid state, but a genocidal state. Some of its ministers are proud to declare that they are homophobic fascists and so on. So we have a transformative change in terms of the image of Israel and its policies, and exposing Zionism as a force in practice is a racist movement. In practice, it's an apartheid movement. And in practice, it is proving to be a genocidal force too. These are facts on the ground that are very difficult to challenge without backing it with obfuscation or lies. Another impact in the region has been the weakening of sectarianism. The United States, Israel, and other Arab regimes have worked on a divide and rule basis, splitting Muslims into Shia and Sunni and so on. As we know, Palestinians overwhelmingly are Sunni if they are religious, same in Gaza. But they are now in solid alliance with mostly Shia people in terms of resistance forces in the region. Similarly with Iran and so on. So there has been a lessening of this sectarian divide that U.S. imperialism has encouraged, especially after the occupation of Iraq in 2003. So that is also an important point to raise. If I move quickly to Britain's role, I think this is quite shocking in what Britain is doing, not only in relation to Palestine and supporting militarily the Israeli apartheid state, but now launching a war against the Yemeni people directly. Indirectly, they were launching a war against Yemen for a good 9 years. This there has been a ceasefire between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, but the US and Britain were the main suppliers of weapons of mass destruction against the Yemeni people. And now that they are engaged in a direct war, United States and Britain, why is Britain so wedded to such a war policy? My own, if you like, initial take on this is that I think British economy, that Thatcherism has destroyed the industrial base of Britain, that shifting to the service industry and so on, Britain doesn't have much left in terms of capitalist profit and making super profits except the city. And now the war machine, relying on the war industry and nuclear power and so on. And this has tied it very closely to US war aims. And this is, in fact, quite a serious point to make. I am not quite certain yet because I have to back it with statistics about the economy, what are the various branches of the economy. But I get the initial feeling and impression and think that transforming Britain and destroying its industrial base has also made it reliant on an alliance with the war aims of US imperialism across the world. We see it over Taiwan, we see it over the Ukraine, Yemen, Palestine, you name it. Britain is playing immediately second fiddle and sometimes even leading war aims publicly, especially say over the Ukraine and now over Yemen too, and Palestine, of course. So these are important points to consider. And I think what's happening over Palestine and Yemen is also encouraging the emergence worldwide of a multipolar world. US imperialism is on the wane, and that the conflict in the Middle East has further weakened US imperialism in terms of its ambitions over Ukraine, Taiwan, war with China, potential war with China. And in the Middle East, their position has been shaken to its roots, that the resistance forces have emerged as a formidable power, and the Arab people have awakened to the fact that US imperialism is using Israel as a base. And without US imperialism, this Israeli aggression and genocidal war would not be going on as it is today. I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Murad, for letting me go on.
No problems at all, Sami, at all. It's always a delight to hear from you and your perspective as an Iraqi Democrat against war. We've not heard any further from Hussam, so I think we should continue this discussion. And Raghad has also left us. She's had to go to some family matters, but that leaves us to have a discourse with Jenny and Sami. So please put in the questions, and I'm going to use my chair's prerogative to ask a few questions. Can I go back to Sami straight away? Sami, I mean, what do you think about Iran getting directly involved, and what impact would that have in the regional conflicts in the Middle East?
A direct Iranian involvement will develop into a massive war, Murad, unfortunately, and I don't think Iran seeks it. And maybe not even the United States, because they know Iran is a formidable military power and they can inflict heavy losses on the United States military and economic interests in the region. But the resistance forces are supported by Iran. But it must be stressed, Moran, that these resistance forces are completely autonomous forces. The Israeli and US propaganda and British government propaganda is that these are some tools of Iran. This is furthest from the truth. Whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Yemen, in Palestine, in Gaza, these are indigenous forces, and they are resistance forces that have grown organically from their own people, from their own countries. In Iraq, they grew out of US occupation of Iraq. In Yemen, they grew out of Saudi-led aggression backed by the United States and Britain. 9-year war. There was a civil kind of unrest in the country, but it degenerated into a full-scale war against the poorest people of the Arab world in Yemen. And their resistance grew again organically. In Lebanon, the most powerful of these resistance forces, it grew because of Israeli occupation of Lebanon, whether it was in 92 occupation, earlier wars of aggression, all the way to the 2000 and 2006 wars of aggression against Lebanon. And this resistance force in Lebanon grew because the Lebanese people decided that enough is enough. And I need not talk about Palestine, because they are an occupied people and they started resisting decades and decades ago, but now their resistance has become much stronger. So Iran is an ally of these forces. There's no doubt about it. And it has supplied them with weapons and material support. And Iran doesn't hide that. They say it publicly. But they also say we do not want a full-scale war. A full-scale war can only happen if the US and Israel continue these genocidal wars against the people of the region.
Thank you, Sami, for that. I mean, the real danger is that they may say they don't want direct conflict, but accidentally both parties do, as we saw in World War I and what that led to. Jenny,
yes, I agree that could happen. Yes,
very easily without people realizing. That's the most dangerous thing, I think.
Sure.
And then obviously the nuclear capabilities are something that we're not sure about in the Middle East, but I'm sure it may involve that as well.
Yeah, you are right, Brad. You're right.
Jenny, can I give you an opportunity to? Is there anything that Sami has said that you want to come back on, or given that he gave a much more regional analysis?
No, I was very interested in it, and I was interested in what he said just now about the fact that they're not Iran's people. I think we're getting quite a lot of evidence, and I'd like to see what Sami says about that the Houthis and the Hezbollah are not necessarily doing what Iran says, so that Iran in a way is playing less of a central role in this than America is, because actually I don't think Israel's doing what America says either quite. That's another interesting phenomenon. I don't know whether Sami wants to comment on that. We all feel that the pressure that America's putting on Israel is marginal at the moment, having a marginal effect. So in a way, there's the most blatant war ever, I fear, between Israel. When I say I fear, I mean it's coming out of this regional conflict, the possibility, as I say, of another world war in which forces that really are fundamentally antagonistic toward each other will fight it out. Do we want that? Well, I don't want more deaths. Do I want Israel to be turned into a democratic and fair state? Of course I do. But ideally by persuasion and conversation and not by a bloody battle. Sorry, so questions back to Sami, I suppose.
How do you respond?
Shall I, Murad?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yes, I fully agree with you, actually, Jenny. You're raising an important issue, which is that the United States is the bigger actor here in relationship to backing Israel, and that Iran, and this has been observed for a number of years now, does leave the big decision-making, if you like, of these forces that they are allied with and they support to do what they want to do. And I am pretty confident from my own very close observation of the region that what the Yemenis do is what the Yemenis want to do. And you could see the millions of people that came out onto the streets 2 days ago in Yemen. And they have been coming out every Saturday in their millions across Yemen. I don't exaggerate when I say millions. They are multi-million. And they are pushing the Ansarullah movement and their government to do much more than what the Yemenis are doing at the moment in terms of the Red Sea and backing Palestinians. In fact, there are hundreds of thousands who put their name and they are begging Saudi Arabia to open a land corridor so that they go and help the Palestinian people break the siege on Gaza. So I can observe it. And Lebanon is the same. Hezbollah in Lebanon is a very powerful Lebanese force. It grew from Lebanon organically, and they do what they want as well. And in fact, if you like, and I share your opinion, that Iran, in fact, doesn't want a big escalation, because a big escalation means a massive war. And obviously, they want to protect their own people from US firepower and aggression and a potential nuclear attack on Iran. I mean, an Israeli minister already raised the specter of a nuclear bomb being dropped on Gaza, and Iran is a big target of such a potential nuclear attack, and certainly the Iranian government don't want to do that. But they have also said they will continue to support these local movements, and they are doing that. But I share your opinion that the biggest actor here is the United States. They can't stop this war tomorrow if they want. One phone call, I think it takes from Biden to say we'll cut off armaments, we'll cut off financial support, and Israel will stop it within days.
Yeah, can I come back a moment, Murad, if I may? Yes. Yes, I mean, another point you made about the young Jews in America. People aren't always conscious over here. Out of the 6 million Jews in America, there's an approximation that 2 million of them are now significantly critical of Israel. This is a huge, and I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Peace over there. And on the issue of the support for Palestinians in Lebanon and in Europe and in Britain, I couldn't go yesterday, but on those marches. I mean, again, I'm looking at it in a moral point or ethical point rather than a political one. But it seems to me that the injustice level and the cruelty level in Gaza it's gone beyond something that people can accept or argue that Israel is under threat, or, that I can't see the usual answers. I'm actually the anger I'm feeling is shared by everybody I meet, virtually everybody. People are very involved. It's gone off the news briefly, but it comes back again.
Jenny,
let me stop.
Thank you for giving us an update on what you think is happening in New York. I've got a few questions in now, so can I switch to them? Felicity has put a few in, but I'm going to go with the one, Felicity, that you've put in as follows. At the core is the demise of one empire and the rise of a new empire. History shows that dying powers become more aggressive and warlike. Does the world just have to wait this watershed moment out until China's power becomes entrenched? Sami?
I'm not sure if it's, empires do tend to disappear gradually, and the US empire is no exception. But I'm not sure myself yet as to the projection in terms of China. What sort of power will it be? I think so far, they have been generally a power for peace. And that is basically because the United States has been such an aggressive power since the end of World War II, with its numerous wars. Some people have counted 45 different wars they have started since World War II. Some count even more. So you have obviously China emerging as a massive economic power. Whether this economic power will become a military power that will threaten the world, I somehow doubt it myself. I think social changes in China that has happened over many decades of liberation war and socialist ethics and peaceful ethics have become strongly entrenched in China. And my hope is that this economic might will not degenerate into a threatening military might. If it's a defensive force, then they need defense against an avaricious or dangerous US power. And I share Felicity's argument that wounded empires or wounded powers can become more dangerous powers. They are wounded tigers and they might lash out. And they are lashing out in some ways over the Middle East and Ukraine. and threatening China over Taiwan, and building a massive military force, pushing Japan to join in this war efforts, pushing Australia. Britain is always ready. I know you need not talk about that. So yeah, this is my perspective on that one.
Okay, well, Sami, just to comment, I have seen a Chinese presence in Asia, and where my ancestral home is in Bangladesh, so it's quite interesting. I mean, the way they're looking at it in Dhaka and places like this is that they're offering development, infrastructural help, assistance with raising finance and what have you, rather than arms and what have you. And finally, the thing they don't do, which I think is appreciated in the global South, is that they don't lecture countries on democracy and human rights. I think they've lost America doesn't realize they've lost that.
Yes.
That ability to stand because of their positions in places like Palestinian issues.
Yeah, I agree with you fully, Murad, there, and you can see it very clearly. The examples you cited, you can see it in Africa, across Africa. African nations are telling America face to face, and Britain, France, and Germany, look, the Chinese are building railways while you are trying to rob us for the last 150 years, whatever it is. So, yeah.
So those changes are happening. Can I go back to the questions again? We've got one from Alan in Taunton Dean. He asks, rather than ceasefire, why haven't anti-genocide forces from the outset called for cease the blanket bombing, which would have created a much more difficult response from Netanyahu and co about the right to defend themselves, and something for us to keep repeating as the best and biggest pressure against Israel for its genocidal murder.
Mm-hmm.
Jenny, how do you respond to that? You've probably got more insight into what
I think it's a very interesting question. I'm just trying to think: is the implication of this, Alan, that Netanyahu would have to say that the reason that they don't really want to just fight on the ground because they know their own soldiers are going to be very much more vulnerable than if they bomb. My only concern about this is that we don't want Israeli soldiers fighting on the ground and blowing up tunnels and killing civilians all around them. I can see that it puts them on it gives Israel a difficult answer to make, but I'm not sure that there aren't risks in it.
Okay. Thank you for that response, Jenny. We've got another Jenny asking a few questions, Jenny Clegg. One of them is to Sami. Can the Palestinian organizations unite? Is the Palestinian Authority call for an international conference? Is this realistic, or a conference of UN permanent 5 major powers with Israel and Palestine? What's the state of play amongst Palestinian organizations, Sami?
After 7 October, Murad, Jenny is raising obviously a very important question. And what has happened after 7 October, and it's been building up over the last 3 months, is that on the streets of the West Bank and Gaza, and in refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and so on, and the Palestinian diaspora across the world, has been a massive demand for unity. You can see it, it's palpable. Every Palestinian you speak to, from whichever faction they belong to, they say we must unite, it's time to unite. And I think this will have an impact. There is criticism of the performance of the Palestinian Authority, especially in the West Bank. But I don't want to go into that because we're talking about Palestinian unity here. So I would leave these questions really to the Palestinian people to voice strong opinions on. As somebody from Iraq and Britain, I live here, is that I would love the Palestinian people's demand for unity to materialize, because this will give them a very powerful voice across the world in any international conference that Jenny has raised. I think Palestinian unity will become a really, really powerful voice across any international forum, whether it is the ICJ or the United Nations or wherever. A Palestinian standing up and saying, I speak for Palestine, and you look behind that person, man, woman, person, you will realize that he or she are telling the truth, that the Palestinians have achieved that, aspired for unity by their own people.
Okay, that's good to hear. The second part of Jenny Clegg's question is aimed at Jenny Mason, and it's an interesting one. Actually, God, it's disappeared there. Where did it go?
It's unanswered. If you go next.
Sorry, that's me. I pressed the button to say it had been dismissed. The second part of the question was, how can anti-Zionists support the Palestinian struggle?
Yeah.
No, I think it says, I thought it was, can a Zionist a ceasefire and the Palestinians, put it more positively. I have slightly different views on this than quite a lot of my colleagues. A Zionist to me means many different things, or rather the word means many different things. And I would answer yes, depending on how that person defines Zionist. So the members of Jewish Voice for Labour who completely are asking for a ceasefire and support Palestinians, as completely as you can, who don't call themselves anti-Zionist, they might call themselves non-Zionist, and they remember the spirit of, those boats, ships carrying people from the Holocaust to Palestine in the early days with an idea of a state that contained both Palestinians and Jews. They consider it as something like a 1967 Zionist who stopped being a Zionist in 1967. So what I would say is, if you mean by Zionist an Israeli nationalistic, that's the word, form of supremacy, almost certainly not. But I'm not too keen on people getting hung up on words completely. I think one has to say, what do you mean by that? And not, I think, can people be condemned if they can't quite let go of the feeling of refuge. I mean, I don't call myself a Zionist, or I'm not a Zionist, but I don't call myself an anti-Zionist. When my mother's ship arrived in Haifa in 1919, having escaped a pogrom, my mother's mother said to her, you don't have to cry anymore. We've reached the promised land. Now, this is all, of course, to now sounds horrific because we know what happened later. But I can't question that. And to some people, that's all that Zionists meant at the time, somewhere where Jews could be safe. So I don't think it's not quite the answer you wanted. That's how I see it.
Okay, well, no, that's,
Murad, can I just say a few words?
Please do.
Yeah. On Zionism, I mean, in my initial speech, I stressed the word in practice in Palestine, that Zionism in practice in Palestine meant apartheid, meant colonial expansion, meant displacement of the Palestinian people. So to that extent, Zionism in practice, regardless of our assessment of the ideology of Zionism as it emerged, as Jenny said, as a nationalist, an expression of Jewish nationalism, which was opposed by the Bolsheviks and communist parties and all sorts of internationalist socialist movements as being reactionary nationalist current. But in terms of its practice in Palestine, then really one cannot escape the fact that Zionism in Palestine, in practice, is an apartheid, colonial, expansionist, displacing the native population, and based on ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing did not start yesterday. It started in the 1930s into the 40s, and obviously in a big way in 1948. So I make this distinction. So Zionism in Palestine, in practice, is a colonial expansionist movement that practices ethnic cleansing and genocide ultimately.
I completely agree, but I do know people who still call themselves Zionists who also say that Israel's apartheid. All I'm saying, these are words to me, but the significance is what you're saying, the ethnic cleansing and the apartheid system. That's not just a word.
Yeah. Thank you, Jenny and Sami, for your contributions. in this plenary session, the prospect for the occupied territories and Gaza and Palestine and Israel. I'm going to hand it back now to Carol. I'm just wondering whether our ambassador is going to be coming through or not. I suspect Carol will be in a better position to know that. But thank you for your contributions. Can I remind those who've joined us during the session that we have the London CND AGM tomorrow night from 6 o'clock onwards. Please do register and the Zoom links will be sent to you. Carol, back to your capable hands.
Thanks, Murad. Thanks, Murad. That is one of the things that I was going to point out. In fact, our annual general meeting takes place at 6:30. But this is a formal decision-making meeting of London CND. So if you're a member of CND nationally who lives in London, if you're an individual member of London CND, or a member of one of the London CND groups, you're entitled to attend, take part in voting, etc. I do have to say, however, that these details have been circulated 3 or 4 times to our supporters, and the deadline is now passed for motions and nominations and so forth. But nonetheless, if you would like to come along, please send an email to London CND. That's info@londoncnd.org, and we will send you a link to register and join the meeting. Mostly, I wanted to say a very big thank you to all of our speakers, to Belle and the panelists, Emma and Sam in the first session, to Raghad Altikriti, who had to leave before the end of this discussion, and of course to Jenny and Sami for an absolutely fascinating discussion on what's happening in the Middle East as well as in Gaza as a result of the Israeli bombardment. Thank you all very much. There's been a lot of a lot of food for thought, I think, and also I hope some inspiration and some encouragement, both to take part in CND and also to continue participating, as I think most people on this call do, to continue to participate in the activities in support of Gaza. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you again to our speakers. The final point I want to say is a big thank you to Julie Samange. Julie's been the sort of hidden face behind the, she's turning on her CND logo now, but Julie has been the hidden technical face, as it were, behind this meeting, this conference. And in fact, Julie has been a worker, the coordinator of London CND for 3 years now. She's done a very good job throughout. Particularly, you will know her for her videos and social media engagements with all of us. And Julie has now returned to France, and at the end of today will be leaving work as our coordinator, and I'm sure you'll all join me in wishing her success in the future. Thank you very much, Julie. And thank you to Jessica, who is no longer on the call, but Jessica is a London CND volunteer who helped to produce those 3 briefings which you've had in your conference pack. The final thank you, of course, comes to all of you, our audience, for taking the time to attend. We hope you will continue to support London CND, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.